Hey there, friends. Did you watch the Democrat debate last night? I say Democrat debate because it's held by Democrats, moderated by Democrats, held on a Democrat channel, and one half of the people involved in the debate are Democrats. So you have one Republican candidate against three Democrats in a Democrat area, and it's all controlled by Democrats. To see somebody like J.D. Vance roll out of there with a massive victory is pretty remarkable to me, knowing that he's behind enemy lines the entire time. First, guys, go check out my friends Attorneys on Retainer. These guys are not an insurance company. You've heard all the old news about the insurance companies, and some have changed their policies because they've got called out on stuff. Why bother going with somebody who has to tweak their policy to make people happy? Go with an actual attorney firm who's already making people happy. These guys at Attorneys on Retainer, they're who I have. They're who I trust my livelihood and my future to, knowing that if I'm carrying a firearm and I unfortunately have to end up using it, I'm protected by an attorney, not an intern on a telephone trying to determine what person they need to pass you through on a switchboard who's going to determine if they're going to cover you anyway. Sign up now, my friends, Attorneys on Retainer, for optimum protection in the unlikely event you have to draw your carry firearm in self-defense. Use my code FTATF and receive $50 off your individual sign-up fee. Again, use my code FTATF and receive $50 off your individual sign-up fee. We're not going to go over the whole debate because there's way too much to go over, and it's actually, again, Vance did a great job last night. But I want to go over the Second Amendment related topics that were in there. Now, what I did is I took this 5 or 6 minute video where they discussed the Second Amendment topics, and I broke it down into individual little segments because there's a lot to address here and to address properly, and kind of on both sides, obviously, mostly regarding Walz, but with Vance too, and I'll explain my reasons why. Here's the first segment of the clip, and this is the longer of the ones that I pulled out. I want you to see what these guys said, and then I'm going to follow up with what my thoughts are.
And like a lot of parents, we send our kids to school with such hope and such joy and such pride at their little faces on the first day of school. And we know, unfortunately, that a lot of kids are going to experience this terrible epidemic of gun violence. And of course, our hearts go out to the families that are affected by this terrible stuff. And we do have to do better. And I think that Governor Walz and I actually probably agree that we need to do better on this. The question is just, how do we actually do it? Now, here's something that really bothers me and worries me about this epidemic of violence. The gross majority, close to 90% in some of the statistics I've seen, of the gun violence in this country is committed with illegally obtained firearms. And while we're on that topic, we know that thanks to Kamala Harris's open border, we've seen a massive influx in the number of illegal guns run by the Mexican drug cartel. So that number, the amount of illegal guns in our country is higher today than it was 3.5 years ago. But what do we do about the schools? What do we do to protect our kids? And I think the answer is, and I say this not loving the answer, because I don't want my kids to go to school in a school that feels unsafe or where there are visible signs of security. But I unfortunately think that we have to increase security in our schools. We have to make the doors lock better. We have to make the doors stronger. We've got to make the windows stronger. And of course, we've got to increase school resource officers, because the idea that we can magically wave a wand and take guns out of the hands of bad guys, it just doesn't fit with recent experience. So we've got to make our schools safer. And I think we've got to have some common sense bipartisan solutions for how to do that.
So a lot of what Vance said there was accurate, and I support him on a lot of his views. But just like everybody else, I tend to see a lot of these politicians as being folks that are dabbling in the gun culture and the gun community, yet don't fully understand it. Like, they'll use some of the left's buzzwords, and Vance did that in this case. Now, he did come back and correct himself slightly later on, but he used some of their rhetoric, if you will. First, he called it the epidemic of gun violence. Well, there is no epidemic of gun violence. There's an epidemic of gang violence if you use the actual numbers. 92 to 93% of any kind of gunshot-related shootings or murders are related to people slinging dope and arguing at 2 a.m. down by the tennis courts in all of your major cities. That's not a small thing. 92 to 93% are in these areas. That's not an epidemic of gun violence. If you're truly looking for a root cause, it ain't the guns. Later on, he actually corrected himself and he calls it the epidemic of violence, which I applaud him on that. Maybe he saw the error of his ways, and maybe it was just a slip up when he called it the epidemic of gun violence. But I think that matters, because whenever you call it, first of all, an epidemic, the left loves the term epidemic because they had so much control over the last epidemic we saw, which was COVID, right? They love that. And they would love nothing more than us be able to declare gun violence as an epidemic, so somehow they can get additional federal funding that would kick in as a result of an epidemic. You think I'm joking? I'm not joking. There are things that are outlined for whenever there's a truly declared epidemic. Certain things go into place, which also means more government control. So they want us to call these epidemics, and unfortunately, I think J.D. Vance kind of fell into that a little bit. But by calling it gun violence, it also is putting that stigma on guns instead of the person. It's taking it away from the actual person who's committing the crime and putting it on the inanimate object. So it's taking any accountability from the person who's making these decisions to shoot other people. So it's really just an ass-backwards way of quantifying a certain event. But again, you're evading and avoiding any kind of accountability for the actual subject, which, let's be honest, in most cases, the people pulling the triggers are Democrats, 90-something% of them. Vance goes on to say that 90% were illegally obtained guns, and that's probably true, because most of the guns used in most crimes are obviously stolen. These people are not going filling out 4473s. That's the argument we make all the time, that the criminals are not using the background check system. Like they keep wanting to say, we need enhanced background checks. Well, they're not using them anyway. They're not waiting for a background check to go through for them to walk away with their gun to go commit their crime. They're stealing them. So no amount of background checks or restrictions on people obtaining firearms is going to make any kind of a dent on the crime used by guns by these criminals, because they don't care. Now, when Vance was talking about school security and said, I'm not loving the answer, and he goes on to say that he doesn't want his kids going to a school that has visible signs of security, I've got a problem with that. Did you ask your kids that? Personally, I love your answer. You talked about securing schools. You talk about making doors lock. You talk about a number of things that would secure a school that would, guess what? Keep a madman out of it. If a person cannot access a school, they cannot shoot a school. But there are children in the school. But the Democrats continuously vote down any of these bills where instead of using money to educate people, we want money that's going to secure the schools and harden them. They vote those bills down all the time because they want these children to be shot. I'm sorry if that hurts I'm really not sorry if that hurts feelings, but I'm sorry for those that find that difficult to process, because it's an absolute truth. Democrats love the fact that children get killed. They make a lot of money off of that, and it furthers their ability to try to force some of these gun control bills through based strictly on emotion. Say what you want. I don't care what you say. They like this. They may not sit out there and high-five each other when it happens, and I doubt they sit there and go, yeah, 10 more. But they're thinking, well, I can push my bill through. So they are indirectly excited whenever this happens. That's the only reason why you can tell me that they are voting to not secure these schools. Now, here is Walz's response to that.
As a member of Congress, I sat in my office surrounded by dozens of the Sandy Hook parents, and they were looking at my 7-year-old picture on the wall. Their 7-year-old were dead, and they were asking us to do something. And look, I'm a hunter. I own firearms. The vice president is. We understand that the Second Amendment is there, but our first responsibility is to our kids to figure this out.
I'm a hunter. So, I like sugar and cream in my coffee. That has nothing to do with school security. That has nothing to do with the Second Amendment. If you're trying to qualify your ownership of a firearm and you being somehow, indirectly or directly, associated with Second Amendment activists and supporters by stating, I'm a hunter, that doesn't qualify you. You can say my favorite color is blue. I like sugar in my rice. I mean, I like pineapple. Whatever. You're a hunter? Great. Great. Do you wear a G-string whenever you hunt? Because that means about as much to me as the fact that you have a gun for hunting. Go read the Second Amendment. Not once does it describe hunting in there. So good for you that you have a hobby that a lot of other people have. Now, enough about your hobbies. Let's talk about the Second Amendment. He mentions that our first responsibility is to our kids. Yeah, it is. You should be a better dad. You should be supporting good, honest, lawful Americans to own firearms and to protect their families. But you're not. You're seeking to disarm people. Yes, you are. You're seeking to disarm people, and you want softer schools so that the children are softer targets in these schools.
In Minnesota, we've enacted enhanced red flag laws, enhanced background checks, and we can start to get data. But here's the problem. If we really want to solve this, we've got folks that won't allow research to be even done on gun violence. And this idea that we should just live with it, and here's what I do think, that this is a good start to the conversation. I 100% believe that Senator Vance hates it when these kids, it's abhorrent and it breaks your heart. I agree with that. But that's not far enough when we know there are things that work.
But you don't know the things that work. Whenever you state you know the things that work, you're guessing. I've said it before, I've said it a million times. You can't measure a negative. You can't say that we put this law into place and we saved the lives of 5 million people. Well, you can't measure that. You can't measure that negative. You have no proof that 5 million would have died prior to that law. There is no way to measure that. So you're supposing that the things you might put in place would save lives. Well, guess what? I'll tell you what. If we give every single person a 9mm handgun, my studies show that that will save 100 million lives over the course of 10 years. It's the same amount of stupidity and guessing that you guys are doing, saying you know what works. You don't know what works. You don't know if anything has saved one life, let alone however many you're supposing that might have been saved.
I've spent time in Finland and seen some Finnish schools. They don't have this happen, even though they have a high gun ownership rate in the country.
First of all, Finland? Really, Tim? Finland? How long did it take you to scour the globe to find a country where you felt like their numbers somehow would back up your argument? Because that's a wild one. That's a wild one. It's not like you pick somebody that is closer to like us, whether it be population, whether it be climate, whether it be cultural makeup. There's a number of things that you could have picked that would have been a little bit. Why didn't you pick Mexico? Why didn't you pick Canada? Why didn't you pick countries that were more like us? Oh, because it's a free country? Somehow it's a little bitty country. Do you realize that the population of Finland is 4 or 5 million? Houston, Texas has that many people. Houston, Texas has that many people, right? So please don't compare Finland with a much more advanced country and a much more capable country with a ton more challenges in it, because you ain't helping yourself. You want to know another thing that the people in Finland do not deal with at the same rate that we do? How about over-medicating our children? This chart right here shows global antidepressant users per 1,000 people. Look who's leading the pack. United States, 110 users per 1,000 people of SSRIs. These are mood-enhancing drugs, psychotropic drugs, whatever you want to call them, SSRIs. 110 users per 1,000 people. Look where Finland sits. Finland sits at 70. That's about 60-something% difference. The United States has 63%, I believe it is, more people taking SSRIs. That's a big jump. That's a big. In fact, when you look at our population versus theirs, and then you look at this number, that number is even more crazy. So you've got way fewer people who are over-medicated taking these psychotropic drugs in Finland than you do here. Before anybody says, oh, just because you take them doesn't mean you're a killer. I didn't say that. But let me tell you this, just like cigarettes doesn't give everybody cancer, psychotropic drugs have a black box warning from the FDA that states this drug can cause mania, homicidal tendencies, suicidal tendencies. The drug itself can do that. So miss me with the not everybody gets it. I get that. But we are certainly polluting a lot of people's systems with drugs that are not intended. These are antidepressants, and in many cases, they make the person more upset and depressed than what the symptom is that it's trying to fix. On top of that, you want to know another thing? You know my book, How to Make a Monster? Remember, I wrote the book on this, guys. Another thing that they don't have in Finland that we got over here. A Pew Research Center study found that in the U.S., nearly a quarter of children under the age of 18 live in a single-parent household, more than any of the 130 other countries and territories they surveyed. Around the world, the average rate of single parenthood is 7%, which is under a third of the rate in the U.S. Over 80% of American kids in single parent households live with their mother only, and that trend is growing. You know, we're in this whole cycle of women are better than men. In fact, if you're a Christian white man, straight, you're the bottom of the barrel according to everybody else, right? We're so busy beating up on men that are good fathers, good husbands. We're losing track of the fact that when you see that number again, right? 80% of American kids in single parent households live with their mothers only. So that's a 25% already. Only 75% of the United States has their children being raised by each parent in the home. And trust me, I understand sometimes the other parent shouldn't be there because they're pieces of crap. But nevertheless, only 75% of the homes have both parents. Of those 25% who are raised by only one parent, 80% of those are raised by just the mother, meaning there's no father figure present. So we've got over-medicated kids. We're sitting here and we're raising them by a mom who in some cases might be working 2 jobs and cannot do the things for these young men that they need to be grown. Am I saying that single parents that are moms are bad parents? No. They're not providing the same thing that a dad does. They're not providing everything from, first of all, the father figure, telling them how to treat women, how to respect women. Look, just being raised by a woman does not teach a young man how to respect a woman. Trust me on this. So you've got all these young men being raised and they're treating women poorly. Their only peers, their only mentors are the other gang members on the streets who are taking the time to do something with them. So they're teaching them how to sling dope, steal guns, and shoot at people. So again, we have things in the United States that do not exist in Finland. Finland is in that number of 7% of the homes who only have one parent. Again, United States, 25%.
There are reasonable things that we can do to make a difference. It's not infringing on your Second Amendment. And the idea to have some of these weapons out there, it just doesn't make any sense. Kamala Harris, as an attorney general, worked on this issue. She knows that it's there. No one's trying to scaremonger and say we're taking your guns, but I ask all of you out there, do you want your schools hardened to look like a fort?
Yes. That's exactly what I want. And to go back to not infringing on the Second Amendment, you're literally, and to say that you're not trying to take guns away, y'all literally are wanting to do that. Not figuratively, y'all literally want to take guns away. You want to ban AR-15s, the one you lied about carrying in combat when you never were in combat. You said the gun that I carried in combat shouldn't be available on the streets of America. You weren't in combat. So you don't even know what it's like to have a gun in combat like that. But you're saying that those should not be in our ownership. We've got millions, tens of millions of AR-15s out there. How are you going to ban those? You have to take those. You're talking about your mandatory buyback. That is a forceful buyback, and then you give taxpayer money in return. That doesn't even cover the cost of that. Yes, this is an infringement on the Second Amendment. Have you ever heard of the Supreme Court? Maybe you should check into that, because that is something that means a lot. Now, as far as hardening our schools, when Walz says the stupid comment about, do you want your kids going to a school that looks like a fort? I do. I absolutely do. But there's this false narrative out there that it's a causation correlation myth, if you will. Here's an article with a Johns Hopkins professor. When schools feel like, quote, prison, test scores, college attendance drop. Students in the high surveillance schools who get punished often can feel less like students and more like suspects. I know you guys, this is some funny stuff right here, but I got to show you some of the numbers from this study. This is going to blow your mind. You see where they're going with this, right? This Johns Hopkins study found that, get this, high surveillance schools, meaning schools with a lot of security in them, mainly because they're in bad areas, high surveillance schools had higher suspension rates. Greater detection led to greater punishment, regardless of the demographics of students that attend these schools. Well, that actually does matter. And let me explain something to you. High surveillance schools did not cause the higher suspension rates. The higher suspension rates were a result of the kids going to that school and had nothing to do with the high surveillance. The high surveillance was put in place to protect the children from the neighborhoods that the schools are in. And knowing that 80% of your fatherless homes sending your kids there, we know that these kids are prone to carrying guns to school. So they had to implement these high surveillance tactics in order to detect the guns that your high suspension rate children are actually using to bring guns into the school. It's the children that are dictating the high surveillance. It ain't the high surveillance making the kids bad. Students at high surveillance schools had significantly lower math test scores. That's because the kids were dumber. The kids were not raised right. Their parents don't do homework with them. The teachers are usually the bottom of the barrel teachers at these poor performing schools. So it's not the high surveillance that created the lower math scores. It's the dumb kids going to these schools that require higher surveillance because, again, they're bringing guns into the school and they're in higher crime-ridden areas. The next bullet, students at higher surveillance schools were significantly less likely to go to college. Do I even have to address that? Excuse me. So the bulletproof glass, the metal detectors, and the high fences are causing these children to have some kind of an emotional breakdown where now they don't go to college? Make that make sense. Black students were 4 times more likely than students of other races to be enrolled in high surveillance schools. Black students were also more likely to be suspended. Please don't explain to me or try to explain to me somehow that because we put a security camera, metal detector, and bulletproof glass that somehow we're only targeting these schools because the students are black. It's the crime rates and it's the things that actually make you need to put those high surveillance things in place. So the crime existed already before the security system was implemented. Let's get that right. You want to pull some dates and some receipts? We can do this.
There's countries around the world that their children aren't practicing these types of drills. They're being kids. We owe it to them to get a fix. These are things that shouldn't be that difficult. You can still keep your firearms, and we can make a difference. We have to. If you're listening tonight, this breaks your heart.
No, we don't have to do anything in regards to taking guns away because, again, that's what you guys want to do. Does it break our heart? Yes, it breaks our heart. Actually, Ted Cruz tried to put a bill up to harden these schools, again, to keep people out. Is it this hard to understand? If a killer cannot make entry into a school and your glass is bulletproof, he can't see children, he can't access children, meaning what? He can't shoot children. Why is that so hard to understand? I don't understand. You can make these schools as soft as y'all want them to be. You'll never get rid of school shootings unless you focus on the person, the people involved. We're living in an era of no accountability. No one has accountability. Keep dropping these charges. Keep letting people have their records scrubbed clean. There's no accountability out there. Nobody cares about getting hit with a charge.
I appreciate what Tim said actually about Finland, because I do think it illustrates some of the frankly weird differences between our own country's gun violence problem and Finland. Is okay, first of all, we have way higher rates of mental health abuse or mental health substance abuse. We have way higher rates of depression, way higher rates of anxiety. We unfortunately have a mental health crisis in this country that I really do think that we need to get to the root causes of, because I don't think it's the whole reason why we have such a bad gun violence problem, but I do think it's a big piece of it.
He was so close. Man, he was so close. When he talks about the mental health and the abuse, he was this close. He can't say the reason why. The pharmaceutical companies control everything. All that pharmaceutical money is not going to allow a single candidate to focus on part of the real problem. And that is a big chunk of the real problem, is the over-medicating with the black box warnings that are making all these people, these young people, rewiring their brains. It's all in my book. and telling them in their brains, making their brains make them more suicidal, homicidal, manic, you're giving people a drug to cure something that is a small problem, and you're creating something way bigger in their mind. And again, you are literally rewiring their brains with the whole exchange of dopamine and serotonin in their brains. You are teaching their brains how to work differently because you're throwing an SSRI at them that is making things happen differently in their brains. It literally does that. That is the purpose of an SSRI.
Another driver of the gun violence epidemic, especially that affecting our kids, it doesn't earn as many headlines, but is the terrible gun violence problem in a lot of our big cities. And this is why we have to empower law enforcement to arrest the bad guys, put them away, and take gun offenders off the streets. I think there's a whole host of things that we can do here, but I do think at our schools we've got to talk about more security.
Amen to that. And back to his point, he's kind of mixing the two right there, talking about school shootings. That's totally separate than the gang violence that, again, I call them confrontational shootings in the bigger cities, the Democrat-run cities. And talking about the charges, yes, you have to press charges on these people and stop letting them plea down. They're putting these gun charges out there. They want new gun laws in place, but whenever they get this person with one or two additional charges on them, in order to let them rat out the person that the main law enforcement people want, they're allowing them to plea that one gun charge or that second gun charge away in order to rat their other person out. So yeah, they still get a couple of charges thrown at them, but lesser charges, because they're giving somebody else up who may not even be the leader of whoever they're trying to pinpoint. So stop letting these people plea down, and these charges will stick, and these guys will start to at least respect the gun laws, maybe a little bit more, just maybe. Maybe they're afraid to go to jail for a little bit longer. Make examples out of them. Give them longer sentences. They'll be like, what? Pookie only got 6 months. Well, that's because he pled that gun charge away. You got 6 years because we made this gun charge stick. Word gets out on the street pretty fast when you do stuff like that.
You previously opposed an assault weapons ban, but it's only later in your political career did you change your position. Why?
Yeah, I sat in that office with those Sandy Hook parents. I've become friends with school shooters. I've seen it. Look, the NRA, I was an NRA guy for a long time. They used to teach gun safety. I'm of an age where my shotgun was in my car so I could pheasant hunt after football practice. That's not where we live today. And several things I want to mention on this is talking about cities and where it's at. The number one where the most firearm deaths happen in Minnesota are rural suicides. And we have an epidemic of children getting guns and shooting themselves. And so we have, and we should look at all of the issues. Making sure folks have health care and all that, but I want to be very careful. This idea of stigmatizing mental health, just because you have a mental health issue doesn't mean you're violent.
And just because you're a gun owner doesn't mean that you're potentially violent. Nobody said that if you had a mental health issue that you were potentially violent. The thing is, they are now wanting to talk a little bit about mental health because guess what? By adjudicating people and making them somehow or another certifiable in some ways and claiming that they have a mental health issue, what's that do? Prohibits them from buying a firearm via 4473. But he talks about how the NRA used to teach gun safety. They still do. Now, the NRA is not near as relevant as they used to be, but the Eddie Eagle program used to be literally in schools. They have pushed out the gun safety training. I'm talking about these Democrats. They don't allow the NRA or anybody else to teach gun safety in schools. So the NRA still does teach gun safety. You guys have just made it a point to not allow them in schools anymore, to teach them in the public school system, but they still do offer all that same training. What you just said was incorrect.
And I think what we end up doing is we start looking for a scapegoat. Sometimes it just is the guns. It's just the guns.
That's just stupid. That is a stupid statement. Okay, you're 15-year-old, or in whatever state you live in, maybe it's 16-year-old to get your driver's license. Your 16-year-old comes walking down the street. Johnny, why are you walking? Where's your car? I wrecked it. You wrecked it? What do you mean you wrecked it? I wrecked it. I ran a stoplight, ran into somebody. I wrecked. Well, why'd you do that? What were you doing? Were you looking at your phone? Were you playing around? What were you doing? Dad, sometimes it's just the car. Sometimes it's just the car. It's that simple. Johnny's ass is going to his room, and he's about to be punished for a really long time by saying something that stupid to Dad. Yet we have a vice presidential candidate that's literally bypassing the human deciding to take somebody else's life, choosing a firearm, watching them make that choice to pull the trigger, and then sitting there looking at you going, sometimes it's just the gun. I mean, Gary over there, yeah, he meant to shoot the guy, but I mean, sometimes it's just the gun. I mean, let's not always fault Gary for shooting all his partners downtown at 2 a.m., right? Sometimes it's just the gun. What a freaking idiot.
I don't understand the point that you're making.
God save the Queen, man.
I'm sorry, I thought this was America. He's so horrible.